for your Eid meal. Complete your Eid feast with our amazing prawn specials, pecan nuts and irresistible deals on coconut milk, coconut cream, olives, fried onions, ilachi, sliced almonds. Explore more in store. Remember, we reserve the right to limit quantities. All specials are while stocks last. T's and C's apply. Eid Mubarak to one and all, and may Allah bring you lots of joy, happiness, peace and prosperity on this blessed occasion.
This Zakat Q&A is brought to you by Al Baraka Bank. Download the Al Baraka SA banking app, view your investment or finance statements for Zakat purposes, and stand a chance to win an Umrah trip for two in our Grand
Mufti,
Ramadan
coming on with your face,
competition.
right?
Uplifting, enlightening,
Mufti sir?
informative. You were listening to Maulana Suhaib Lasanya
No
on
face.
Radio Islam International.
Mufti sir, you can just add your camera, right?
No, I'm not using camera.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome back to Radio Islam International for our weekly fiqh Q&A program, and it's time for our weekly Zakat Q&A program. As we mentioned that in the month of Ramadan we have lots of queries, lots of people want to discharge their Zakat. So there's lots of questions surrounding Zakat. We have a dedicated slot that has been dedicated just for our Zakat Q&A program. So if you have any Zakat related questions, the SMS and WhatsApp number is 072-786-1548. That is 072-786-1548. And our expert from Jamiatul Ulama South Africa's finance desk, Mufti Muhammad Haffeji, Sahab Damat Barakatum, will be answering your questions this morning. So my engineer indicates to me on the line we have Mufti Muhammad Haffeji. Firstly, Mufti Sahab, Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Maulana Suhaib, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and to all our esteemed listeners of Radio Islam International. It is indeed a pleasure and a great honor to be with you once again this morning.
Jazakallah, we really appreciate it. You have taken out your precious time so that we can take the questions from our listeners. You can be of benefit, and with the expert knowledge that you have, vast knowledge that you have in this finance department, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a means of sawab jariyah for yourself, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from you. How are you? How is Ramadan thus far, Mufti Sahab?
I mean, Jazakallah to us, Maulana. All well, can't complain, as is the case with everyone, acknowledging that Ramadan has just gone past so rapidly, unbelievable. And we just make dua that Allah Ta'ala accept our broken efforts thus far and grant us the fortitude and the strength to make the very best of what little is left, inshallah.
Inshallah, taqabbalallahu minna wa minkum. Mufti Sahab, let's move on. Lots of messages coming through regarding zakat, so let's try and answer as much as possible. The first message reads, I received an amount of money in February. I discharge my zakat in the month of Ramadan every year. This year it's in March. So what do I do for the new amount?
The question conveys a sense of the individual having an understanding that if they received money in February and their zakat year-end date is coinciding with March this year, then the understanding is that their zakat should not be paid on this particular amount. This is not the case. It's important to bear in mind that there is widespread misunderstanding on the one-year rule. The one-year rule does not necessarily imply that an individual has to have a zakatable asset on hand for 12 consecutive months in order for zakat to be paid on that particular asset. In other words, what it does mean is that what an individual needs to look at the beginning of the zakat year as well as the end of the zakat year. If at both points the individual is in a zakat paying position, in other words, after deducting current liabilities, their net zakatable wealth is above the nisab rate. In that case, zakah has to be paid on everything on hand. Therefore, even though an individual may have received funds only in February and the zakat date is coinciding with the month of March, the amount received in February may still have to be subjected to zakat if the individual was in a zakat paying position last year at the same time.
Jazakallah khair for that. Next question reads that can we deduct the tax we pay from our salaries to SARS every month from our zakatable amount, the whole year's tax? And what about vehicle installments, Mufti?
So we have a double-barrel question here. First, in terms of deducting tax dues from one's zakatable assets, it's important to bear in mind that for any deduction to be made from one's zakatable assets, the particular liabilities have to materialize. They have to have arisen already. They have to already be on one's account and applicable, payable, so to say. So, if any particular deductible is being considered, but it has not yet materialized, it may just materialize. It's in other words, it's contingent on a particular event in the future. In that case, those liabilities cannot be deducted. So while it is the reality that taxes are deducted from income, but the income at the same time has not yet been earned. So the individual or an individual cannot deduct the entire year's foreseeable year's tax dues. What they can deduct is, as at their zakat year end date, whatever is the quantum of tax liability that has already materialized, it's already due and payable. That amount can be deducted as it is a due on one's wealth. The second part of the question relates to the aspect of deduction of vehicle installments. In the scenario of vehicle installments, if the arrangement is with a conventional financial institution, in that case, a deduction of a maximum of 12 months can be considered. If the arrangement is with an Islamic financial institution, then we need to look at the particular nature of the contract itself that is being used by the Islamic financial institution. Let's just use one example of the contract being a lease-based contract. If it is a lease-based contract in which the person is using to purchase a motor vehicle through the institution, then it would make sense to only deduct one particular month of a liability or installment, given the nature of the contract itself. I hope that addresses both parts of the question, the aspect of taxes as well as the aspect of deducting of vehicle installments. Obviously, if further detail is required or assistance is required in terms of deducting their vehicle installments, they can make contact with myself on 011 373 8000, inshallah.
Ji, Jazakallah khair for answering that question and explaining in detail regarding two parts of that question. Moving on further, Mufti Sahib, next question from one of our listeners. It reads, can zakat be given to my children? One of them is in debt. Also, I owe my children some monies for nearly 8 to 10 years now. So, do I account this for zakat calculation?
Okay, so two parts once again. The first part about giving zakat to one's children who are in debt is concerned. Remember that there are three categories of individuals who cannot qualify as recipients of zakat from a donor. One is the donor's ascendants, the second is the donor's descendants, and the third is the donor's spouse. In the scenario at hand, we have a case where an individual donor is contemplating giving zakat to their own children who qualify as descendants. Therefore, the zakat cannot be given to descendants. Yes, those descendants of the donor may be in need. They may qualify as recipients of zakat. They can receive zakat from another source, but not from their own ascendant. Therefore, an individual parent cannot give zakat to their own children or grandchildren for that matter. This is irrespective of the quantum of debt or the fact that they do qualify for zakat. The basic rationale for this, if I can just add, is that when giving zakat to these three categories, it is tantamount to moving zakat from one's right hand to one's left hand. Therefore, I'm just putting it simply, it would amount to keeping or withholding the zakat, purely by virtue of giving it within one's own immediate circle or immediate family of ascendants, descendants, and spouse. However, if those individuals qualify as valid recipients of zakat, they may receive zakat from an external source. In terms of this particular questioner owing their children money for something like 8 to 10 years, in other words, what's going to be happening technically here is the individual, when calculating their zakat, would just deduct a liability of what they owe. So on the one hand, they would have all their assets totaled up. On the other hand, they would have all the amounts that they owe to other people, and what they owe to other people will be deducted. At least the current portion of what they owe for the next 12 months will be deductible from the total asset base. Thereafter, if the result is still equal to or above the nisab rate, zakah will be payable. If it is below the nisab rate, zakah will not be payable.
Jazakallah khair for that answer, Mufti Sab. Moving on further, the next question says that I had my Kruger coin from last year, Ramadan. I sold it in a month of January and I used the money. So the question is, Mufti Sab, do I pay zakat for April 2023 to January 2024? Or how do I work this out, Mufti Sab?
So, my understanding of the question is that last year Ramadan, on the zakat year-end date, the Kruger coin was still on hand. Therefore, for last year, sorry for that, zakah would be payable on the particular Kruger coin. However, during the course of the year, between last year Ramadan zakat year-end date and this year's zakat year-end date, the coin was sold and the money was used. In other words, what has happened is the asset is now depleted in all its forms. In other words, it's no longer in the form of gold and it's no longer in the form of cash. Therefore, the asset is not on hand. For the current year, no zakah is going to be payable. However, for last year, on the zakat year-end date, zakat will be payable since the Kruger coin was on hand and not yet sold on the zakat year-end date.
Jazakallah khair for that, Mufti Sab. Next question says that please advise me. I was retrenched and invested my payout, which I receive monthly, to pay out my expenses. So, how do I calculate my zakat?
The first thing to consider is the moment of retrenchment. At that time, when the individual was being retrenched, what sort of options did they have available to them? My impression is that the amount that was granted as like a severance pay or something of that sort was voluntarily invested in a particular avenue. What this means is that it's going to translate into two considerations for zakat. The first consideration is the current value of that investment would have to be considered for zakat purposes. And the second aspect is the drawdown that is being utilized monthly. Whatever portion of that is saved and still on hand would have to be considered for zakat. So we have two entries on the asset side in terms of the zakat calculation. One is the total value of that investment, if it is Sharia compliant, and the other entry is the aspect of the saved portion of the monthly amount that they are drawing down. Whatever is saved and still on hand would have to be considered for zakat purposes. I've only addressed the aspect of the asset side because only that information is revealed. Obviously, the individual would have to consider their liability side now and make deductions of current liabilities and thereafter determine whether zakat is payable or not.
Jazakallah khair for that, Mufti Sab. Just to remind our listeners, time right now is 28 minutes past 10 o'clock. You are listening to Zakat Q&A program on Radio Islam International, and the expert that we have in the house is Mufti Muhammad Haffeji from Jamiatul Ulama South Africa, who's answering your questions with regards to Zakat. So any questions, any queries that you have regarding Zakat, do send us a text message or WhatsApp message on the number 072 786 1548. That is 072-786-1548, and inshallah Mufti Muhammad Haffeji Sab will be answering your questions this morning. Mufti Sab, next question. A person gives his or her scenario and then wants to know a question regarding zakat. The person says that I invested an X amount in Bitcoin as long-term investment to eventually own a portion of Bitcoin, not trading with Bitcoin though. I still haven't recovered my principal amount and so far only got paid a fraction of revenue. So the question is, do I need to pay zakat?
First principles in terms of zakat on any asset is that zakat is not doesn't only apply if a particular asset is generating revenue. Zakat is not only payable or when the individual has recovered their principal amount on any particular investment. Zakat is payable on an asset once, number one, it is recognized as a zakatable asset, and number two is there's a current market value for it. That value is what needs to be considered for zakat purposes. So In the scenario where an individual has invested an amount in a supposedly compliant Bitcoin, Islamic Bitcoin, Sharia compliant Bitcoin, irrespective of whether they are trading in it or not, or the amount that they invested has been recovered or not, zakah would still be payable. The individual would need to consider the current value of that holding. Let's put it that way, in order to pay zakat. So, if we were to put it hypothetically, if the individual were to sell up their share and withdraw completely from that investment as at their zakat year and day, what amount would they receive? If there is an amount that they can disclose, or there is an amount that they can obtain from the provider service, the intermediary, obviously that amount would need to be then considered for zakat purposes.
Jazakallah khair for answering that question. Next question reads, my father passed away 8 years ago. He had an investment account for my brothers that he had used as collateral with the bank. The company thus far have not acknowledged this investment and we can't access this for some reason. So are my brothers liable to pay zakat on this? And all we know is that the last amount it was worth about 100,000 rands.
This is a very interesting question because it touches on a very critical principle of the Sharia in terms of the Sharia's difference with conventional discipline of accounting. Um, Essentially, what we have is a case of an asset that is lodged with another party, but the other party with whom it is lodged, supposedly, is denying that the asset actually exists, or the asset was actually lodged with him. Right? So we're taking it on face value that wherever this sum of money or this investment was placed, that particular company or service provider or individual is denying that the security was lodged in the first place. Thus, from a Sharia perspective, is a true definition of a bad debt. So we understand the accounting bad debt is debt which has been written off or has not been able to be recovered for a period of time, despite being pursued. But from a Sharia perspective, there's a slightly different definition from a fiqh perspective of what bad debt constitutes. So, in this particular scenario, there's one part of the bad debt requirement that is being met from a Sharia perspective. The one part is that the individual company with whom the collateral was lodged is denying that the collateral was even lodged in the first place. The second aspect still needs to be clarified, whether the individual who lodged the security, is there any evidence on their part to state or to inform that there was a particular security lodged? That's the second part. Let's assume that both conditions are met in the sense that they are unable to provide proof that the asset was lodged as collateral, and the company with whom the collateral was lodged supposedly is denying that the collateral was lodged. Assuming both conditions are met, in that case, the asset is regarded as, from a Sharia perspective, bad debt and would not have to be considered for zakat purposes, purely by virtue of being wealth which is unrecoverable or unrecognizable in this particular scenario. Zakat would not be payable on the particular amount. Obviously, I've just tried to provide a response or some context based on the information provided. Given that the individual is presenting a question on behalf of brothers, their own brothers, I would encourage them to establish contact with us on 011 373 8000 to dig a bit deeper into the nuances of the particular question itself.
Jazakallah khair for answering that question. Moving on further, looking at our WhatsApp line, the next question says that I would like to know if zakat is payable on dead stock in a business.
So, as I explained earlier on, zakah is payable on an asset as long as an asset is recognized from a Sharia perspective as a zakatable asset. So, a dead stock in a business is, for all intents and purposes, recognized as a zakatable asset. It's currently intended for resale. If anyone were to walk in the store and make an offer, the goods would be sold. They just, for now, classified as dormant or dead stock in the mind of the business owner, purely by virtue of how long they've had it on hand. But for all intents and purposes, that stock would need to be subjected to zakah as at their current market value. Remember that in the case of dead stock, the current market value may have depreciated so much that it's even below cost. And therefore, even that figure, despite it being below cost, would need to be considered for zakat purposes. This is purely by virtue of the stock still being still being held on hand with the intention of resale, therefore being classified as stock in trade for zakat purposes.
Jazakallah for that, Mufti Sahib. As we are coming closer to the day of Eid, there's a question that reads, can one pay zakat money to a Muslim worker as Eid? And can you sponsor a Quran to the worker with zakat money? Please advise.
Two parts to the question, but before I get to that, I think when I usually receive these questions of giving zakat or aid to a worker, it always prompts me to provide some kind of context before actually answering the question. And that is the aspect of ensuring that our workers are fairly paid and adequately paid according to the kind of work that they are doing. It should not be the case that as employers, our wage policies and our wage structures are deficient and they fall short in terms of the amount of work we extract from our employees. And then there's a question of now utilizing our zakat and our lillah and all of that for our charity, for our own workers, right? And I'm saying this because when giving our own charity to a worker, there is an indirect form of benefit that we derive by giving them an additional top up, so to say. Whereas zakah specifically is not geared towards deriving any kind of benefit for the donor. So, in this particular scenario, let's get to the questions itself. If the particular Muslim worker does qualify as a valid recipient of zakat, after having been assessed for their zakat assets and their deductible liabilities. If the Muslim worker employee does qualify as a valid recipient of zakat, zakat can be given. In theory, zakat can be given by the donor to the employer, in this case, to the employee. That's number one. Number two is it can be given under any pretext. Zakat can be given just without saying anything. It can be given by stating that it is zakat. It can be given by stating that it is a gift, and it can also be given as a form of an Eid token. However, I must emphasize, as I said earlier on, it should not be a case that the wages are not adequate, whereas we're using zakat now to keep the employee satisfied. In terms of discharging or utilizing zakat to purchase a Quran, what this boils down to is converting zakat from cash to kind and then giving the zakat in kind away to the employee. So it's important to bear in mind that their best case scenario is to give zakat in cash so that the recipient has the freedom and the liberty to decide where and how to utilize the funds. If zakat is going to be given in kind, in other words, converted from cash to some particular item, like a Quran, in this case, the crucial requirement for valid discharge of zakah would be transfer of ownership. Therefore, the Quran would need to transfer from one person, the donor, to another person. It becomes the property of the recipient now, and the recipient can decide what to do with what to do with the particular item that they received, whether they want to retain it and use it for personal use, or put it on the market and sell it and derive some cash for it. The prerogative will rest with the recipient who received that zakat item in kind.
Jazakallah khair for answering that question, Mufti Sahib. Moving on further, still lots of WhatsApp messages are coming through. This particular message reads, if I gave my sister zakat money since she is able to receive zakat, can I receive gifts from her to us and our children? Will that be in order, Mufti Sahib?
2 points to be made. Number one is that zakat can be given by one sibling to another sibling. Right? That's clear if the sibling who is receiving does qualify as a valid recipient of zakat. Number two is once the individual qualifies and zakat is given to that particular individual, the status of the funds is no longer zakat now. It's ordinary funds, and those funds can now be given, can be utilized or employed in any way as the recipient deems appropriate. So if the recipient deems it appropriate to purchase an item and give it to the donor as a gift, as a gesture of kindness, fine, well and good. It's fine. There's no problem with it. It's acceptable. The only condition I can add is that zakat should not be given on a conditional basis. It's not that one sister has given their zakat to another sister on condition that the recipient sister purchases a gift, which is rare, but it does happen. That's why I'm outlining it. As long as it's not conditional that something has to be purchased or the donor is not expecting anything, it is in order, the zakat discharge will be valid.
Jazakallah khair for that. Next question says that a lady is divorced and she has 4 kids, 2 of whom are baligh but still young. Their father doesn't pay any maintenance towards them at all. So is she allowed to be a recipient of zakat on their behalf if she does have the zakat nisab herself?
It's important to bear in mind that for zakat, under ordinary circumstances, each individual is assessed on their own merit after they are baligh. So, if the two children are already baligh, although young, but they baligh already, they need to be assessed on their own merit in the particular scenario. So, if especially given that there's an absent father in the particular scenario, uh, it would be urged that the individuals, the two children, be assessed on their own merit. Therefore, if the children on their own merit qualify as valid recipients of zakat, they can receive zakat. Thereafter, since they are baligh, they can appoint their own mother as a representative to receive zakat on their behalf and employ those zakat funds in their best interest. It's important to bear in mind that this assessment of each individual on their own merit uh, makes a difference in terms of determining zakat and allocating zakat to the correct recipients. There is one exception though. The exception is when an individual has got a father who does not qualify as a valid recipient of zakat. In that case, the children may not necessarily qualify as a valid recipient of zakat. In the given scenario, I'm only pronouncing on the aspect of the father being an absent father, not performing in any way. There is a view that the mother does assume the position of a wali or a representative of her own two children, but since they are baligh, they should be assessed on their own merit.
Jazakallah khair for that. Next question has 2 questions in it. It says, firstly, is zakat payable on goods in a business not showing profit? And secondly, is zakat payable on property not fully paid?
So, even though a particular commercial endeavor does not generate profit, it does not necessarily mean that it is disqualified for zakat or does not have to be considered for zakat. The mere fact that the goods in the business are recognized as a zakatable asset alone is good enough reason to ensure to attract a zakat obligation. So even though in the particular question, the business is not performing from a generating profit point of view, zakat will still be payable on those goods as long as those goods are intended for resale. It's a different matter if the individual has now surrendered and given up and decided to rather utilize the goods for their own personal benefit or distribute it among the poor and cease doing business. In that case, yes, the zakat, those goods will not be subjected to zakat. For as long as they remain goods intended for resale, zakat would be payable. In terms of zakat being payable on property, immovable property, it's important to bear in mind that zakat is not payable on the value of immovable property itself. We're only considering zakat on immovable property that does generate revenue. If the immovable property generates revenue, then the saved portion of revenue is what needs to be considered for zakat purposes. If the property itself is not generating any revenue, no zakat will be payable. If anything, I can add in this particular scenario, since it's not yet fully paid up, there may in fact be a deduction of a liability in terms of what they still owe on that particular property. So on the asset side, there will be a whole host of assets. On the liability side, one of the liabilities will be the current portion of what is still to be paid on that particular immovable property that will qualify as a deduction.
Jazakallah khair for that. Just to remind our listeners, time right now is 16 minutes to 11 o'clock. You are listening to Radio Islam's weekly fiqh Q&A program. And this is a dedicated slot where we're taking zakat only, zakat related questions. And we have an expert in house from the finance desk of Jamiatul Ulama South Africa, is Mufti Muhammad Haffeji, who's been answering your questions this morning. So if you have any questions, any queries for Mufti Muhammad Haffeji, the SMS and WhatsApp number is 072 786 1548. That is 072 786 1548. Mufti Sahib, moving on further, the next questioner says that I have money in a bank and I live off the dividend and banked it every 6 months. Am I still zakatable or am I still zakat liable?
In order for an individual to be paying zakat, they need to be clustering all of their zakatable assets. In the particular question, we only have the particular zakatable asset of cash or an investment. So if this particular investment alone, uh, on its own, exceeds the nisab rate, or together with other zakatable assets, the individual is surpassing the, the zakat nisab rate, then zakat would still be payable. So an individual, even though the individual is utilizing the sum to survive and to live off, zakat will still be payable on the net balance of the wealth on the zakat year and date if that net balance is exceeding the nisab rate after deducting current liabilities.
Hmm. Jazakallah khair for that, Mufti Sahib. Next question says that when is zakat payable and what is the nisab to not have any gold? I do run my business from home mechanic. I do have some stock. Please advise.
There seem to be a few parts to this question. The first part is when is zakat payable? Let's deal with that part first. Zakat is payable 1 year after becoming or being in possession of surplus zakatable wealth. In other words, what happened is a year after becoming or being in possession of surplus zakatable wealth after deducting current liabilities, zakat needs to be paid now. What that means is that zakat does not necessarily or always have to be paid in Ramadan. If an individual first came into possession of surplus zakatable wealth on the 1st of Rabiul Awal, for example, 1 year later, on the next year, Rabiul Awal, 1st of Rabiul Awal, if they are still above the nisab rate after deducting current liabilities, zakat will be payable on the 1st of Rabiul Awal. They can obviously then utilize a portion of their zakat or discharge a portion of their zakat in Ramadan itself just to accrue the reward of fulfilling a fard obligation in Ramadan. In terms of the nisab rate, if I recall, if my memory serves me correctly, the last zakat nisab rate that we have on file is 9,800 rand, roughly 9,800 rand. That is the nisab. The third part of the question was the individual does not have any gold. In other words, that particular line item of a zakatable asset is not there. All the individual needs to do is discard gold and consider all of the other zakatable assets, which I'm coming to. In the particular question, there's reference to a business, the individual being a mechanic of some sort. So, in other words, what they're going to be doing is for zakat purposes, since they have some stock on hand, which is mentioned in the question, the stock which is intended for resale will feature as a zakatable asset. Any cash on hand or cash in the business would be considered for zakat purposes. Any debtors, any clients who owe money would be considered for zakat purposes. That's on the asset side. On the liability side, the individual would need to be considering any current liabilities, like maybe you're owing some other mechanics or some other suppliers of parts and so forth. Anyone that you owe money to on a current basis, maybe rental for the premises, there may be some telephone costs, there may be some fees, maybe some subscriptions you have, any monthly obligations that you have can be deducted from these zakatable assets. After making the deduction, if the total zakatable assets are still above the nisab rate, zakat would be payable.
Jazakallah khair for answering and explaining those numerous questions from that listener's question. Moving on further, Mufti Sahib, next question says that I have sold a property and there is still an amount outstanding. It has still not been paid in full. So, do I have to pay zakat on that money already paid to me or pay zakat on full amount?
With respect to this particular question of an individual who sold a property and is awaiting payment, um, there's a very important classification of debt from a Sharia perspective. I'm not going to go into the detail because I purposely do not want to confuse, or intentionally do not want to confuse our listeners, right? So, for all intents and purposes, in this particular scenario, what will happen is the individual needs to pay zakat on the amount that they have received thus far. Since they sold the property already, some portion of the amount is already been paid. That particular quantum that is being received would have to be subjected to zakat if it is still on hand on their zakat year and date. As far as what is outstanding is concerned and what is yet to be paid is concerned, the individual would need to be considering the amounts that they will receive whenever they receive it, and they would have to pay zakat on that particular amount for the amount of years that the amount was outstanding. So, if let's say 3 years have lapsed and 50,000 rand has been outstanding, it comes today, this year, it comes a day before our zakat calculation for this year. What it basically means is that 50,000 has to be, it only got received this year. It was outstanding for the past 3 years on a property that was sold. In this case, 50,000 would have to be subjected to zakat for the past 3 years as well. So we're looking at 3 years of zakat on that particular sum of money. This is purely because of the kind of classification that I've assigned to the particular debt that we're dealing with in this case. Alternatively, the individual can pay zakat on the full outstanding balance, and then whenever that outstanding balance is received, they do not have to then back pay any zakat. If the individual is still unclear on what to do, or anyone else is in a similar predicament and unsure how to determine the zakat, how to manage the obligation, then they are free to contact me on 011 373 8000, and I will gladly assist, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair for assisting your for forwarding your assistance. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. Mufti Sahib, next question says that my brother does not have a job and therefore does not earn any income. Can I give zakat to my brother to help him take care of his family?
Before answering the question, I think it's important. This is a question that does, prick the conscience a bit, in the sense that if an individual is living and is aware of their own brother who is unable to make ends meet, I think it's cause for concern in the sense that someone is in this particular scenario. But the greater concern is that it does not have to be zakat that we have to always consider. There's an obligation on ourselves, on even each one of us, beyond just zakat. So yes, zakat may be considered, but it's also important to bear in mind that we have a broader obligation, and there's nothing stopping us from utilizing other wealth on our own family members to ensure that our own family members and our kid and kin are okay, and they're surviving, and they are okay in terms of being looked after. In terms of the question itself, a sibling can give zakat to a sibling as long as the recipient sibling qualifies as a valid recipient of zakat. Number two is that the zakat, when given by one sibling to another, it should be ensured that the zakat is not given on a conditional basis. That the recipient must utilize it in the XYZ fashion or in XYZ avenues. Once the recipient is qualified for the zakat, it should be given unconditionally so that the recipient can utilize the wealth as they deem appropriate.
Jazakallah khair. As we are coming to the end, we have last few questions left. Mufti Sahib, next questioner says that is zakat payable on savings account where salary is deposited?
The mere fact that the account is a savings account and is a store of wealth, irrespective of whether a salary is being deposited into that particular account or not, the fact that it is a store of wealth would mean that it would attract zakat, and zakat should be considered. So the individual would need to utilize or consider their net balance in that particular savings account for zakat purposes. I
Next
haven't added the
question.
aspect of deducting the
Yes.
liabilities. So they may be receiving a salary, the current liabilities would need to be deducted, and the net balance would be considered for zakat.
Mufti Sab, next question says that if a person is in arrears with rental and has given notice, but there is a deposit holding by the landlord that can offset it, but the arrears have to be paid first before deposit is released. So can it be paid towards zakat, and when a deposit is returned, that amount be given out again?
It's important to bear in mind that whatever deposit has been given or advanced by the tenant to the landlord is, for all intents and purposes, wealth which the individual tenant has no access over. In other words, that wealth is considered as wealth that is not even on hand. And by virtue of the tenant being indebted alone, if the debt itself, considered with all of the other debt obligations, exceeds the tenant's zakatable assets, then the individual will still qualify as a recipient of zakat. So the zakat can be utilized if the individual qualifies as a valid recipient. It can be utilized by a well-wisher or donor. Zakat can be utilized to fulfill the arrears. And then whenever the deposit is received, the deposit is now just been wealth which is now freed up. The deposit itself does not necessarily have to be given out again. If it is released and now the tenant has got access over that wealth, it's a matter of the donor deciding to just leave it to the luck of the tenant. Now the tenant is of means now once again, hopefully, and is able to continue with their life. Uh, in other words, what has happened is the donor has just freed an individual who is in a difficult position in terms of arrear rental, number one, and number two is not having access over their particular deposit.
Hmm. Mufti Sab will take the final question and then we'll terminate this segment, this program. So the final questioner wants to know that is it not permissible to give your zakat out every month? Does it have to be given out on a specific day after 1 year?
So my impression of the question, although it's a bit brief, is that there's some doubt regarding zakat, giving out zakat, prepaying zakat every month. There is permissibility. The questioner may be suggesting non-permissibility, but there is permissibility of prepaying zakat on a monthly basis, provided that the wealth on which zakat is due is on hand. The individual is duty bound to be paying zakat. In that case, zakat can be settled on a monthly basis, or prepaid on a monthly basis. However, it does not preclude the individual having to still do a recon on an annual basis. So there still needs to be a specific year-end date on which the zakat will be assessed. The full comprehensive position will be considered, and zakat will be determined in the sense of whether they've paid enough, well and good. If not, then a top-up needs to be discharged to fulfill their zakat obligation.
Wonderful. Jazakallah khair, Mufti Sab. We leave it at that. We really appreciate your precious time that you have taken out to take the questions from our listeners, and in your vast knowledge that you have regarding finance, you managed to answer so many questions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. But I'm looking at my WhatsApp line and messages, Mufti Sab. There's still so many questions that are unanswered. Perhaps if it's possible, if you can kindly give out your email address or the office number where they can contact you during office hours if they have still more queries, Mufti Sir.
Definitely. So I do apologize to all of the listeners whose questions could not be responded to this morning and maybe even in the past. It's unintentional. If they do require any further assistance, they can contact myself or any one of the other 8 muftis in our department. Our telephone number is 011 373 8000. The number once again is 011 373 8000. And the email address that they can utilize for questions is ifta, IFTA, at jamiatsa, jamiatsa.org. It's ifta at jamiatsa.org. In conclusion, I just want to seek an apology from yourself, Mulana. I'm grateful for your service rendering and an apology from all our listeners also. And I also would like to thank the sponsor of the program, Al Baraka Bank, for ensuring that they came to the party to educate our listeners on the critical aspect of zakat. I make dua that Allah Ta'ala accept from one and all our ibadat, including our zakat, and grant us a favorable another month of Ramadan, inshallah, and a joyous and happy Eid, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa
Amin.
rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Amin to all your du'as. Taqabbalallahu minna wa minkum. Jazakallahu khair. That was Mufti Muhammad Haffeji from Jamiatul Ulama South Africa's Finance Desk discussing with us, or rather answering questions that we received from our listeners regarding zakat. Time right now is just 2 minutes to 11 o'clock. We need to go for 11 a.m. news bulletin, followed by our weekly